Hello and welcome back to part two of Betting People with Tim Carroll. Now, we started part one with a question that you sent in from Twitter, and we're going to do the same for part two because Tom Wilson has got in touch, and it's a very good question, actually, which had me pondering. What's the main difference between the betting culture, analysis and approaches between Hong Kong and the UK and Ireland? He would be interested in the factors and methodologies most valued in Hong Kong as opposed to over here. That's a great question, I think, from Tom Wilson. So, Tim, please take it away.
Yeah, it is a very good question. I think Hong Kong is far more data-driven, and that's from the top to the bottom. Now, by that, I mean, if you go to the races in Hong Kong, Happy Valley's a little bit different. It's got a bit of a social atmosphere because a lot of people pour in after work. But overall, especially if you head out to Sha Tin, everyone's there trying to make money. To give you a comparison, I suppose over here it's far more social. If you go to the races over here, sure, there's people there that are trying to make money, and even people that are there for a social occasion probably would like to see their bets winning rather than losing. But it does have a far more social feel to it. Whereas in Hong Kong, at Sha Tin, you never see anyone running around with a beer in their hand. They're all running around with a form guide, their pens, and their notes. Then at the sort of higher levels, when I say the higher levels, the more professional people over there, it is very much data-driven. There's people working off algorithms. If you go back to the Bill Bentner days 20-odd years ago, for people not familiar with Bill, just go and look up the name. He's probably the most successful racing punter of all time because he worked out how to create a database, a massive database with all these algorithms, and you bet accordingly. And he ended up making, when I say millions, I mean literally tens of millions, because they've got a very big pool over there, a lot of liquidity in the tote. So I would say in Hong Kong it's far more data-driven than it is here. To be fair, though, you are talking about two racetracks. You're talking about a small group of horses, a small bunch of trainers, a small bunch of jockeys. So it would be easier to, I want to say easier, I suppose, yeah, it would be easier to apply the system, and it's more likely to work in that scenario.
Would you say, due to those sort of cultural differences, that you prefer to bet in Hong Kong, or actually, seeing as you're known for being an expert on racing in Hong Kong, I would ask you, would you prefer to bet in places where there's a lot more data? Obviously, Hong Kong is sort of a world leader in it, but you can get pretty detailed data in Australia, New Zealand, and America. Some might say that there's more you could access there compared to here. So would you prefer to bet where there's more data? And do you think that you lose some of your edge if everybody can see what you're seeing in an easily accessible format?
Yes and yes. Yes, I prefer it if there's more data, and yes, I suppose you can lose a bit of an angle there. I saw some data recently, actually, only released the last few days, so I haven't been able to go over it fully, but it was making the point that people are finding more winners in Hong Kong now, and the downside to having that understanding and that knowledge is the average price is coming down a little bit. But I'd much prefer to have plenty of data. I think it's hugely helpful. If you have a look at the Hong Kong racing site, I would say it's the best racing or club-owned racing site anywhere in the world for a punter. It's got everything, whether you're talking about weights of horses, whether you're talking about, I mean, a steward's report on a race over there can be like that. It can be like, one race over there is like a steward's report for the entire meeting. Over here, it has multiple replays, it has replay angles, it has just about anything you can think of. As far as preferring to bet in Hong Kong, I do like betting in Hong Kong for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I'm a great believer that you can only load yourself up with so much work. I can't bet everywhere because I haven't got time to do the work that's required to bet in some sort of serious manner. The other thing I would say too, without touching on too much of a sensitive area, along with Japan, there's no doubt Hong Kong's the cleanest racing in the world. I'd include Australia in that. I'd certainly include over here. Anyway, America, you name it. I mean, they actually go to the point now where they definitely are on the side of caution. Jockeys go over there. They only have to ride twice a week. They get the big dollars, but they also know if they put a foot out of line, what might be a 3-week suspension over here or a 3-month suspension in Australia, they'll be gone. They'll be. I mean, Chris Muntz a few years ago got jailed for basically taking a bit of cash for tips. Now, I'm not saying he didn't deserve to get into trouble, but there's not too many jockeys I know that have ever been jailed for, putting their hand under the table and taking a few bob for giving out tips. But It's a very clean product. It's a very clean product. And, you know, look, you don't want to be too critical, but we've seen recent things, whether it be here, whether it be in Australia, or in America, that would tell you. I actually think racing's cleaner than what the average person believes it is, but you'd be very naive to suggest that it's 100% rigid ditch.
Yeah, I do completely agree with that. And the recent case in Ireland, I think, does raise an awful lot of questions, which hopefully the IHRB will tackle in the fullness of time. At the moment, I should say, at the moment of recording, Charles Burns has lodged an appeal against his 6-month suspension.
What you tend to find, William, if I could just add quickly, what you tend to find is where you've got, not that the money, the prize money is that bad in Ireland, but you tend to find where you've got high prize money in places like Australia and America, people are trying to find an edge, i.e. steroids, that sort of thing, and trying to find an edge to win. Whereas where you've got low prize money, that's when you start to get problems with non-tries for obvious reasons. People are trying to bring handicap marks down, or they're trying to set a horse up for a punt. Now, people can sit there and debate that all they like. They can be offended if they want to be, but that is actually fact. History shows us that. High prize money means that you get people like in America, they have a drug problem there. We know they do. Hopefully they'll get on top of it. In Australia, which is probably Hong Kong aside, is probably the most strictly governed jurisdiction I've ever seen. They still have problems with trainers trying to find an edge, whether it be through, you know, Darren Weir and a Jigger, one of the leading trainers in Australia, and whether it be with performance-enhancing illegal medications. And yeah, as I said, that's something we've seen throughout the history of racing.
I don't think there'd be many people who disagree with you. I personally do fully agree. And again, I really think it'll be interesting to see what comes out, especially if there's more judgments on that appeal in the recent case involving Charles Burns, in that case in Ireland. Just on punting in general, would there be any sort of piece of advice that you'd have for punters? Because everybody, especially lots of people who've been guests on Betting People previously, they have their own methods, they have their own lessons. Let's take 3 from you. What are the 3 sort of punting do's actually that you'd want other people to take?
Well, I think you've got to use a method that works for you. And believe you me, if you're just starting out, you'll probably try 1 or 2 that don't work. You learn your lesson along the way. Anybody that I've seen that's been successful, whether it's just making, playing percentages and making a few extra quid, or people who make a living off it, and I know a few, the 2 things they definitely have, the 2 ingredients would be, firstly, they've got a lot of control, and secondly, they put a lot of time into it. It's like most things in life, the harder you work, the more time you put into it, the luckier you get. So that's one thing. Well, they're the 2 things I would say. You've really got to be controlled, and you've really got to put a lot of time into it and do your research. The other thing is too, you've got to understand that, I suppose a little bit left field, I don't think people allow for enough variables when they're looking at the race, or maybe they don't understand the variables. Look, a really easy one to understand, a good example is, let's have a look at Frankel v Zoffany in the St James's Palace. Now, Zoffany finished around about a pound behind him, just behind him. Is there anyone out there that actually thinks that Zoffany is within a pound of Frankel on their best form? So now you've got to have a look at, well, why did he finish so close? Now, the reason I'm mentioning this one is because it's very obvious and it's very easy. The ride given to Frankel that day was far too aggressive, and the ride, I'm not trying to knock time. I kind of get the feeling they might have been after a bit of a rating. I don't know if there was a conversation before the race, but it's very odd to take off in a race like that when he did without needing to. But the bottom line is the ride was too aggressive, and that's why Zoffany got as close as what he did. You've got to allow for variables, and the more variables you can allow for, the more variables you can understand. A little bit like Bill Bentner, you have a look at the variables he was allowing for, by goodness, the better you'll be. I would suggest anyway. And
just last but not least, you've got a favourite sort of jurisdiction to bet in, which we know is Hong Kong. Do you actually have a favourite type of contest you like to bet in? We've had people on this program before who have had their favourite systems and methods and also favourite races. I was just wondering, is there a particular type of race you like to bet in more than others?
To be fair, I also like betting in America because the handicap system over there is nearly non-existent, so you can sort of take out the play. I'll be honest, I know it's a little bit boring. I tend to find the higher the grade, the more reliable the horse, and the more likely you are to get what you might call an honest race. By that I mean, the tempo will be right. It won't be too quick or it won't be too slow, because these are good horses. I do prefer the higher end. I prefer the higher end over here as well. If you have a look at the article I put up on ATR in Hong Kong, they start the bottom grade over there as a class 5. Every horse, if it's a debutant, if it hasn't started anywhere else in the world, will start on a mark of 52, which is a class 4 handicap. You don't have a maiden over there. And they go up through the grades. Now, occasionally you'll see I'll nap one in a class 4, very rarely in a class 5. But most of the naps, I mean, some of the meetings don't have anything higher than the class 2 anyway, but most of the naps, if they're available, are in the higher class races. Or it's a progressive horse you can see coming through the grades. It's just gone from a class 4 to a class 3. It's gone up 8 pounds. It's landed at the foot of the weights in class 3. In your opinion, that horse is going to be going around in class 2 company in the not too distant future. Well, you know, at the foot of the weights in the class 3, it should be winning that if it gets the right sort of race set up. So look, to answer your question, I prefer the higher grades. It doesn't have to be a grade 1, certainly doesn't have to be a grade 1, but I just prefer betting on horses I consider are fairly good horses with a bit of quality about them.
And last but never least, just to ask on this point, but would you say, when you think about all the sort of different elements to racing around the world, would you say generally that a better punting experience can be found in one place over another, or do you think it's the sort of thing that all evens out? And actually, another question I've just thought of, what's your best betting memory?
My best betting memory, to answer that, I can tell you now, because I was only 17 at the time, so I better be careful what I say. I didn't have my jockey's license. I dropped in and out a little bit because of my weight problems. And I was riding a horse called Double Dandy Track Work, and he'd won a couple of races out in what they call the provincial area outside of Sydney. Then he put in a couple of horse spins. And I remember the boss, Harold Riley, who was an ex-New Zealand trainer, very good horseman. He decided to give him basically a month off, and then we sort of worked him for a week or two, a bit of slow work, and we gave him a gallop at Warwick Farm in Sydney. And I was fortunate, especially track work. I rode some good horses. It's like that old saying, it was just like sitting in a Ferrari. It was incredible. And I came back, I said to Harold, gee, I think we might have to have a few quid on this on the weekend. You know, this was a gallop on the Wednesday. And I'll try to cut this short, but I've got to tell you a story because it's quite a nice story. My dear grandmother, bookmaking, and owned a couple of horses and that type of thing along the way. I rang her up, and she was still alive at the time. I said, look, there's one going around at Randwick on Saturday. I reckon it can probably win, and it's 33 to 1 on the tissue. The paper used to come out early back then. Do you want to come out to the races? So I grabbed her, and we got caught in traffic. Now, we worked out, and I'll be honest, so it was just going back in the 80s. We're going to have $200 on the horse. We're going to pair it up with another horse she liked in the race, take them to win and run second, to pair it on the field in the trifecta or tricast. So I picked her up, and the idea I was going to go to the bookmakers expecting to get 33 to 1. Anyway, we got to the races late, but we got there in time, and I had to run, and it was a long way to the bookmaker's ring, but the tote windows were a lot closer, so I just ran straight, because I could hear, I think it was Ian Craig saying they're loading up, put the 200 on the nose, the Double Dandy, took the trifecta or the tricast Double Dandy, I forget the other horse's name, to win and run second, the field for third. Never saw the race because still walking out to the front, heard the call, and Double Dandy goes on to win the race. This other horse that she picked out's run second, and some 33 to 1 squibs run third. And I'm thinking, great, 33 to 1, 200 on. You know, we've got 7K coming back here, got the trifecta for a couple of times. Then I've heard them call out the tote dividends, 244 to 1. So I picked up nearly 50,000 there. The trifecta's paid a tick over 30,000. I've got to go in twice. Probably shouldn't say this on here, but I'm sure they can't take the money back now. I was only 17, so I gave the tickets to my grandmother, so I think you better collect this. So that's the best punting story I've got. Had a fairly good one on a couple of horses that Ask got a couple of years ago. But yeah, but there's been some hard luck stories along the way as well.
I think an absolute classic betting people tale. Thank you so much for your time in part 2, Tim Carroll, and to everybody watching this, especially from Twitter. Tomorrow, we're going to ask him all of your questions.